Okay, well, today I want to talk about the Jubilee. I want to talk about what the essence of the Jubilee is, what it needs to do, what it's sort of supposed to do, and then use that to perhaps frame the design characteristics of it. This is going to be hard, and I'm probably not going to do a very good job. I apologize. There's a whole lot of different things that have to be put into place here, and frankly, I'm not sure which of these have been well defined already, and which, frankly, I even understand well enough to articulate clearly. But this is sort of the gist of it. In a previous video, we talked about this notion of what happens when you have two different kinds of games. You have a game like Monopoly, where there's a notion of a sort of it's a finite domain, and there's a way to play it. There's strategies where you can play it better than others, and there's a notion of winning. There's a way to achieve victory in Monopoly. And then there's this other kind of game, which we just call friendship, right? A friendship group. And it doesn't have those kinds of characteristics to it. Right? One doesn't necessarily win friendship. You can be a better friend, but it's anti-rivalrous, right? To be a better friend actually has this characteristic of everybody wins when everybody's a better friend. It's synergistic per se. And in fact, that point of synergistic value I think is important here. That one of the characteristics of these games like Monopoly is that they are most fundamentally extractive. Right? They are about redistribution or shifting the distribution of values that exist. So let's say I've got $100. Monopoly, I've got $100. Well, I guess whatever, $10,000. And the nature of the game of Monopoly is that there's a finite number of dollars, 10,000. My objective is to get all of them on my token. Right? I want all 10,000, and I want everybody else to have zero. That's the notion of this extractive game. An extractive game is about inside some finite domain getting complete control over the scarce resources. Then you have this other kind of game. This other kind of game is dominated or characterized by the notion of synergy value, the notion of creation of value, the notion of how cooperation and collaboration and division of labor and the ability to achieve different levels of expertise, specialization, and things like that, has the capacity to grow the size of the pie from 10,000 to 100,000. And these are the two games that are more or less fundamentally in tension. That if we're all playing the cooperation game and we're growing value, that's all well and good. But if there's a niche, if there's somebody in the game who plays the defection game, they play the extraction game, then they will sort of locally, if they're not caught, if there's not a way of policing defection, they will locally take a larger portion of the pie to the detriment of everybody else. Right? And so what ends up happening is there's sort of a cycle or a dynamic where, if the pie is growing fast enough that we're okay with, or we don't even notice or don't feel the local optimization of those who are playing the defection games, then the pie continues to grow. But what of course happens is that at the margin, somebody somewhere begins to notice, hey, wait a minute, I'm contributing to the whole, but I'm actually not getting the full return. The loop isn't closing. Somebody else is taking more than they're contributing. And, oh, hey, hold on. And then, of course, there's a little bit of pullback from the contribution to the whole. So the pie begins to not grow quite as fast. And more of the nature of the game focuses on competition in defection space, right? The tragedy of the commons. And at a certain threshold point, there's so much focus on competition for subdividing the pie that the pie, in fact, stops growing and begins to shrink. And then, of course, if you're not playing the pie, the defection game, the interior game, then you're beginning to really seriously lose, right? And at that point, you can start to get a collapse. Okay, so holding that as a frame, one of the challenges here is how do you change this cultural logic? How do you change the dynamic where there's an orientation towards watching for the opportunities to play the finite game, to win the finite game, to try to redistribute the pie so that you get a bigger piece than other players because of the nature of how you're playing the game. And this is where the Jubilee comes in. All right, now I'm going to map a different frame here. So hold that previous frame. I'm going to put another one into the mix. This is those S curves. And we've talked about those innovation curves. And an S curve is basically a learning curve, more or less. So I've got some new domain, some new thing that I'm trying to figure out. And for a while, a lot of effort is put on figuring it out. So there's a lot of energy and exploration and practice and building competence and capacity without a whole lot of return on that investment. But if the domain contains the possibility of big wins, let's say it's, well, the classic example that I've used in the past was oil. So there's a lot of oil and it has a lot of potential. Then at a certain point, we get good enough at playing in that domain that we start getting increasing returns, and the S curve starts to accelerate up. And then there's a point at which we're so good at it that it becomes the dominant mode. Like everybody's playing this particular game, and there's like training mechanisms in schools and formal structures for learning how to do it. And we've actually begun to have a proliferation of subsidiary microgames that are premised on the previous game and stuff like that, like the automotive industry that's premised on the oil industry. And we're kind of in the middle of the S-curve. And now this thing that had been innovative and new is now mainstream and sort of the nature of reality. And then you start climbing up the top of the S-curve and begin to get to the end of the possibility. What was potential has now been turned into actual. And it's actually getting harder to get returns. That there's a more energy and research and effort to get the same level of return. Oil is a classic, simple example. There's a point at which you've sort of taken all the oil out of the, or not all, but you've taken enough of the oil out of the ground that it's actually harder and harder and harder to get the same amount. And you get to the top of the S-curve, right? And that entire approach begins to reach senescence. Now, in the classic tainter model, as you get to the top of the S-curve, the carrying cost of the society that was using this particular resource, in this case oil, isn't going down. In fact, it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger, so that as you're having to work harder and harder to keep your energy level flat, your energy demands are actually going up. And so you actually reach a point where you start to not hit demands, and there's a decrease in demands. Now notice how this maps exactly to the previous story, right? There's a point at which the pie ceases to expand, and there actually starts to be competition for what is now a less than abundant resource, a scarce resource. Not just competition a little bit, but competition a lot. We actually literally can't meet all the demands. Some people are going to start going without. Of course, this then begins the process of playing the game of the inside, playing the monopoly game. Okay. Now, just for those who think about these kinds of things, yes, you can shift, right? When you get to the top of an S-curve, there are ways to shift to a new S-curve. And this is a big part of technological civilization, is the ability to do that. So we can shift from oil to solar panels, right? And hey, maybe solar panels go through a 30-year period of being at the bottom of the S-curve, and now they're very much moving in up that. They're not mainstream yet, but they're accelerating in that direction. And that changes some of the underlying dynamics, right? And that's yes, that can definitely happen in some sense. The point is we want everybody to be ultimately oriented in that direction. So here comes the next sort of major problem. And here, in some sense, now we're getting to the point of the Jubilee. Sorry for all that buildup. Imagine if the nature of the Monopoly game was that whoever had the most dollars got to play the role of banker and got to play the role of adjudicator in rules disputes. All right, so there's a feedback loop. All right, so we have a frame where we have this game, Monopoly, and we have this interesting characteristic where the more successfully you win the game, the more power you have over the characteristics of how winning the game is decided. So we might call this money power. There's a feedback loop. Now, of course, obviously, when that happens, you're going to start getting a game that begins to very rapidly collapse to a small number of players have won, like they own the game, and every effort to change or modify the game will be pushed back. Right? So this is a double whammy, right? One, I've got the basic rules, and those basic rules allow somebody to win, but they also allow the one who has begun to win to feed back on the rule set, to change the rule set in a fashion that is called niche construction. Right? They engage in niche construction to support their own continuing winning. All right, now here's the challenge. Let's say you've gotten towards the top of an S-curve on a particular social game. Right? You're at a point where your complicated system is beginning to kind of reach its end of life. It's becoming senescent. And so it's time to change the game. But the game is owned, is controlled by the ones who won it. The ones who are doing the best in the game also are the ones who are in a position of control over how one goes about modifying or changing the game. Well, they're also the ones who are the least motivated to change the game. Right? And any change in the game, by definition, if they've done a good job in niche construction, is down on their local fitness landscape, i.e. it works to their detriment. So you're going to try to figure out how to convince these folks to change the game because it's better. The game needs to change. Hey guys, this game is over. We need a new game. But they're going to be not particularly interested and in a position to prevent that from happening. You got yourselves a problem. Now, this problem happens all the time, right? Because we have been trying to do civilization in this extract from the commons, in this extract from from complexity and into complicatedness, right? Because we build civilizations out of complicatedness, we end up creating games of this sort, and we have these S curves. And as a certain threshold is crossed, where the ability of winners of the games to create niche construction that supports their particular winningness, we get locked in. But the laws of complicatedness don't stop. And so we end up at a point where we really, really need to change the game, and we really, really can't. And this sort of ends up in one of three major endpoints. The worst endpoint is where the ability of the elites to resist valley crossing, to resist changing the game, is strong enough that the pressure that is put on the system to change the game never quite gets there until it just collapses. Right? This is the deep thing of what's really going on in the collapse of complex societies is two factors. One factor is the pressure that's being put on the complicated system, right, as it's reaching higher and higher levels of end of life and senescence and fragility, very tainter curve stuff. And that the elites actually so completely dominate and control the game, who of course are the furthest away from feeling the pain and the necessity of change, that it really reaches massive levels of fragility. And then when it finally has to pop, it pops a lot. This is the fall of Rome, is that kind of thing. The collapse of the Bronze Age is that kind of thing. The second is what we typically would call a revolution. In the second, the need for change continues to build up. Of course, it's coming from the complex, right? It's coming from human relationality in the most fundamental sense. It's coming from nature in its most fundamental sense. Instead of it's novel, there's an innovative characteristic to it. There's some kind of new form emerging on the interior of the current environment. And if it has enough power, if it has enough capacity that it can disrupt the elite control over the system, then it will essentially at some point tear, it'll break, it'll rend, there'll be a discontinuity and then a transition to whatever this new emergence looks like. And by the way, because this new emergence is actually emerging both in relationship with the characteristics of the environment that it's in, and be more specific. But right now, for example, we have a new emergence that is emerging around the capacities of digital that are very different than the capacities of analog. Right? So we have a system, an S-curve, that was developed back in the 1950s, right, in a very, very analog environment. But we're not living in an analog environment. So we have analog institutions, and they're old and senescent and not effective. And there's lots of other things. I'm just using analog as a way of describing it. And we have these emergent institutions that are trying to figure out how to do something and shift the whole system over to a new S-curve. But also, not only are they trying to figure out how do we play this new digital game well, but also they have to figure out how do I actually outcompete these old institutions. They have to learn how to wage war while trying to figure out how to do new stuff. And so the nature of what they look like is a mixture of those two tensors. Some part of the tensor is how do I do a really good job of doing social, cultural, civilization stuff in this new digital milieu. And another part is how do I fight back against the control structures of the old institutions? And so you kind of get a whatever the blend of that looks like, some of which isn't necessarily very pretty. And that's why, by the way, sometimes revolutions end up being quite bloody, right? Because if the tension's high, like compare the French Revolution as an example, right? The French aristocracy had the capacity, and in fact chose to use that capacity to prevent what happened in England. Right? So in England, you had a not entirely terrible transition from the feudalist to the post-Enlightenment modernist capitalist society. In France, they're like, no, we ain't doing that. We're sticking with the ancient regime until it got so intense that the emergence of this new thing had to keep mutating until it found some version that was virulent and powerful enough, i.e. the revolution, that it could break through. And then when it broke through a lot, right? So you tend to have a lot of breaking, the more tension there is. You could even say like collapse is sort of a version of that at the very farthest extreme. And then you have the third, which is frankly pretty rare, but we're going to try to figure out how to design for that third being not just commonplace, but always. And the third is where something happens where the elites actually become, let's say, enlightened and choose to steward the emergence of the new, even though it's not in their local best interests, right? They're obviously giving up the old game, they're bringing in the new game, but it's in their global best interests. And this goes back to that frame of the Monopoly game, right? You can imagine if you're the winner of the Monopoly game, but you kind of know that the Monopoly game is going to end, and you're going to sort of step back into the position of just being one friend in the friend group. You won't have an incentive to try to figure out how to continue to just fucking dominate the Monopoly game. You'll be thinking about, okay, well, cool. How do we transition out of the Monopoly game and back into the friend game and make sure that's actually nice? And in fact, can I find some way to make my winning the Monopoly game earn me currency, value, prestige, relationality in the friend game? Make it a fun game. Can I actually participate in the Monopoly game so it's fun? So everybody's like, oh, cool, I'm glad we played that, and you're really cool. Even though you won, I don't really feel any animosity. In fact, quite the opposite. That was a beautiful game. And if you ever played like basketball or something, there's this, sometimes it shows up where the two teams lose track of who won the game because it was a great game, and the winningness was part of what made it possible for a beautiful game, but the beautifulness of the game was the point. And then of course you want to keep playing. Infinite game. Okay, so imagine Jubilee. Imagine that we had some kind of deep design in our game structure, in our civilization structure, whereby there was a clock that at some point in time, let's say 50 years, every 50 years, there was a straight up reboot. I'm going to use reboot instead of reset because reset's been taken, and reboot's a stronger idea. So I'm thinking old-fashioned Windows PC where you actually like press the red button, or even stronger, you unplug it and it completely powers down, and then you plug it back in and it boots back up. And in the meantime, maybe you change the BIOS. So let's say every 50 years, we have a hard reboot, which is to say that we really completely change the entire complicated system. And so anybody who won the old game can't carry anything over into whatever new game we create. This is a move from the complicated back down to the complex, and then from the complex back up. And so you move it down, over, and up, not side to side. Not from complicated to complicated, but complicated to complex, back to complicated. And so let's simplify. Let's make it very simple. Let's imagine that the Jubilee is at first just a debt Jubilee. Right? So every 50 years, all debt is extinguished, and sort of that's that. So, obviously as the game begins, year one, people are differentially positioned, whatever it happens to be, but some people are borrowing and some people are lending, and some loans play out and some loans don't, and the game continues to move forward and forward. And of course, as we know, anybody who's looked at the math of this thing, the debt game has a tendency of concentrating. As you win more and more, you have more and more resources that you don't actually need, so more capacity to lend, and interest builds, right? And so it tends to have this concentrated characteristic. And so for the first, 15, 20 years, 25 years, there's going to be it just is the ordinary debt game. But when you reach year 20, you're suddenly going to notice the absence of 30-year loans, right? Because everybody knows that at year 50, 30 years from now, it's just going to disappear. Well, maybe not the absence, but the interest rate on 30-year loans is going to change a whole lot. Certainly by year 40, you're not going to see any 30-year loans. And so the debt landscape changes a lot. Like if you're in the business of issuing loans, and by the way, in the business of taking loans, as you get further and further along that arc, the cultural logic of what is in fact just the game theoretic play changes completely. Right? There's very little point in being holding large capacity to make loans as you get towards the end, because it's all going to reset. You definitely don't want to have a big portfolio. So people are going to be moving out of debt, and that changes the underlying landscape. Now, if you're narrowly in just the debt landscape, there's lots and lots of ways for somebody to launder their winnings in the debt game. They can buy lots of land, or they can buy equity, or whatever. Or they can buy an army and a fort. So they can launder their winnings in this game across the Jubilee into another game. Right? And now we get to the design characteristics. A Jubilee, a real Jubilee, capital J, asterisk, real Jubilee, is defined as a filter, an eye of the needle, whereby nothing can migrate from a complicated system across to another complicated system. Right? It must go through the complex back into any new complicated system. It has to go from the complicated into the complex. Monopoly game, right? There can be nothing about the way you participated in the Monopoly game that doesn't have to cash out in friendship before you can play in another game. Right? If you're able to say, like, okay, and by the way, the winner of the Monopoly game somehow has some durable status. Like, I can take my Monopoly money and I can use it to buy real things in the real world, by example. Then there's a lot of it starts to move you in the direction of caring a lot more about winning the Monopoly game. Okay, so that's it. Like that's the nature of the design characteristics of the Jubilee. Right? It has to be designed in such a fashion. It has to be comprehensive enough, deep enough in both scope and in nature, that all that which has been taken from the commons, all that has been moved from being held by the whole and for the purposes of the whole into complicated structures, corporations and money and laws, fill in the blank, has to actually go through a period of complete erasure. And then from the basis of the commons, commoning, a new structure begins to emerge. Now, this seems insane in some sense, right? It feels really scary. And here's one of the real problems. This is because we're living at the tail end of an almost complete elision of the commons, right? So imagine, back to our Monopoly game. Imagine that we only had Monopoly. We've been playing Monopoly for generations, and it was the only way to survive in the world was to play fucking Monopoly, man. I got to use my Monopoly money to buy stuff, and there was no friends. Nobody was friends. People didn't even know what friendship meant. It was a weird concept that maybe you had a word for, but nobody had been friends for 500 years. Well, then obviously, right, if I said, hey, you're going to have to get rid of Monopoly and the way you're going to manage your life is through friends, you'd be very scared. That sounds very rough. Okay, I agree. We're in a very bad spot. We've made a categorical error of almost completely eliminating the fundamental substrate of the commons, of the complex, as the primary mode by which we support our collective livingness, and have gotten way out over our skis in this complicated system. And the notion of deleting the complicated system and supporting ourselves in the commons feels literally insane. It feels like it makes no sense at all. And oh well, it's where we are, man. One way or the other, you always go from the complicated back to the complex. The complex is the ground. So we're either going to go through a collapse approach, let's call it the hard way, and go all the way back down to something very basic and human, which in this context would be really basic. Or there's going to be a revolution, which is kind of a return to the complex in this weird intermediary step and kind of ugly. Or we can try to actually steward our way across it and be thoughtful about it and make it not quite as insane and crazy. But one way or another, that's how it's going to play out. And the Jubilee, the point of the Jubilee is to make it so that we are bound never to put ourselves in this circumstance again. Right? We always ground a huge fraction of livingness in the commons, my friends, so that you don't end up with this optimization algorithm against a particular finite game, sucking so much of social capacity and human capacity that leaving the game feels like suicide. It feels existential. Right? We need to be in a position where we can in fact leave the game and still be perfectly okay, or at least have the courage to move through that process of reinventing ourselves. So let me give you the other side of the coin. And this is new. This is novel in history. If you imagine the Old Testament version of the Jubilee, which, by the way, was more comprehensive than just debt. One of the interesting things about that period of time was that the degree of change in technical capacity, the possibility space of what could be done under new institutions, was relatively small. And whatever. Every 50 years, not a whole lot changed in the Bronze Age or in the Axial Age. So the reset, the reboot back then, was kind of a reboot to an institutional structure that we knew and understood and was effective. So we're kind of going from corrupt and senescent and overburdened to, kind of new. It's almost like a human cycle of birth and death, or phoenix cycle, but it's back to, right? It's back to. In our case, we've got a different vibe, and we actually are moving forward in terms of the potential. What's possible now is just very different than what was possible back in 1950. And so if we could actually get rid of the constraints of 60, 80-year-old institutional commitments, design characteristics, and of course the corruption and senescence that's set in since then, the new institutional designs that we could put in place that are actually designed thoughtfully and well for our current capacities would just be a lot more powerful. We could do a lot better. This is like, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the story of the introduction of cell phones, but cell phone infrastructure was sort of better and faster in places like Brazil and Taiwan, because analog phone systems hadn't actually been very successful. They hadn't rolled out well. Jungles and whatnot made it hard to do. Whereas in the US, it took a lot longer and wasn't as good because everybody kind of already had phones. And so both, you had the incumbent phone system saying no, and people didn't really demand cell phones as fast because the phone system worked okay. And so they were able to leapfrog over. Kind of like that. Like you could imagine a giant social cultural leapfrog into a new basis that is just vastly more powerful, and by the way, more fun, because the technological curve has changed a lot. I mean, just imagine if we set a 50-year timeline, which seems like a lot these days, but let's just say we did, 2070. Just imagine right now we're going to design something. We're going to have a Jubilee. We're going to design something. And we're going to design something knowing that in 50 years that's going to go away. We're going to do a full reboot on the basis of 2070. I would propose that 2070 is going to be a lot different than 2020. There are going to be capacities and possibilities and potentialities and, frankly, problems and challenges that are very, very different than the ones that we have right now. And it would be appropriate to gift to that future the ability for them to design on the basis of what those capabilities are, and not have to deal with trying to redesign or struggle with or manage through on the basis of whatever stuff we come up with now. So that's actually quite good news. If you can imagine getting over this hump right now and building in the Jubilee reboot into the system architecture deeply so that it can't be gamed by niche construction, then you actually get a really powerful flip, right? Where each phase actually gifts to the future phase all the development that happens to it, but then steps back and allows that future phase to cohere around the potentials of what has happened in the intervening time frame, and then it leaps to the next one. Right? You get these very powerful feedback loops. All right, so obviously there's a lot to be talked about outside of this, but we've already gone on now for almost 30 minutes, which is a pretty big bite, and it feels like this is a nice place to stop.